Hi, I'm Bar Hemov, music director of Collective 366. I'm here with one of our vocalists, Amy Alstrom, at the venue where our next concert will take place on November 2nd, titled Sinfonia Illuminata, which is dedicated to exploring the music of the mid-classical era and its spread throughout Europe. This is going to be our very first fully historical program at 4:30 Hertz, and Emmy brought with her today her 4:30 oboe. If you would like to say a few words about it.
Sure. This instrument is sort of a hybrid between an older Baroque oboe and a modern oboe. So the Baroque oboe only has two keys, this one and this one. And this classical oboe, this is a late classical model, so it has 8 keys, which allows you to play with a little bit more facility in various keys and tune some of the notes a little bit better and have more variety of color.
Yes, which we will most definitely need because we have basically all 7 keys, I think, in this program, so it will be very helpful.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know, what was your vision in forming this orchestra, and what made you think about modern instruments versus historical instruments?
So I always had a very big affinity for the classical era in particular, and what I have seen from both historical groups and modern groups is that the point of emphasis is either on very early music or on the core repertory, and somehow I always feel like classical repertory gets pushed to the sidelines. So I wanted to create a group that sort of flips this balance where the classical era is at the forefront and we diverge from that into earlier and later things. We've already had one 20th and 21st century program. And our next program will be a 4:15 Baroque program. So this one is our first program of a classical era repertory that's being performed entirely on historical instruments.
Cool. You always find fascinating repertoire that I've never heard before. So how did you find the repertoire?
So some of these pieces I've been familiar with for years, and some have come to light as I was doing the research for this particular concert. And again, so some of them I've been dreaming of performing for years, and it's a great opportunity for that. But some, like for example the Symphony by Smetagel, is something that I didn't really know existed until I decided that I wanted this program to sort of be a pan-European program that encompasses everything. So we hear very little from the British Isles coming from that era of music history, aside from perhaps Arne and Boyce. So I decided to look at what else is out there, and I found William Smetagel, who I think is just absolutely magnificent and should be just as well known as his peers, who actually had a lot of influence on him, along with influences that derived from the Mannheim School, because some London publishers were issuing this music as early as 1763. So we hear this influence from both worlds, mainland European and local British music, and he just does a wonderful job. And then we have the symphony by Ignaz Franzl, who actually comes from a very well-known environment at the time. He comes from the Mannheim School, but somehow he is not as well-known as some of his other contemporaries from the time, such as Stamitz and Holzbauer and Knabisch. So Franzl was actually a very prominent violinist, and he held positions both in Mannheim and later when the entire court moved to Munich. His symphony in C major is his last one, and it's actually his longest contribution to the genre. And so some scholars have assumed that it has influences coming from the emerging concertante style from France, because of the prominent flute solo, even though the French works have usually 2 or more soloists, but definitely there's influence coming from there. as well. So again, another reason I picked this symphony is because of the multifaceted influences. So what repertoire at 430 Hertz have you been familiar with so far? What did you get to perform and how was the experience like?
Yeah, well, as an oboist, one of the first pieces I worked on in high school was the Mozart Oboe Concerto. It's a piece every oboist has to learn for auditions. So that piece was super familiar to me. And then Mozart Oboe Quartet as well. Mozart Symphonies, I played those in high school. So there was a lot of Mozart at first. I also learned about the music of Haydn and early Beethoven, or Brahms is a little bit classical in style. So those are the first pieces that I was exposed to. And then over time, as I picked up this instrument, I got more familiar with other composers like Gossec and J.C. Bach and music from those composers, which was very interesting.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So I've always been curious about the name of this orchestra. What's the meaning behind the name of the orchestra?
So, well, I guess collective is collective. I was just thinking about an alternate name for ensemble or orchestra, or some people call their groups collegiums. I was thinking about maybe something that's a little different, so I came up with collective. But the interesting part is really the 366. It refers to Mozart's Commercial 366, which is the Domineo, and I think it's synonymous with the mission of the orchestra, because what Mozart does with the Domineo is he pulls from everything that came in Italian opera series before that, with all the emerging influences from French tragedy lyric as established by Gluck at that time, and he sort of finds a way to combine everything that came before and everything that's emerging and set the tone for what's going to come. And again, this is sort of what we're trying to do with this group. We're trying to encompass pretty much 1,000 years of musical repertoire. So that, I think, would be the reason why we came up with that name.
Is that why you chose K, collective,
Right.
instead of C, collective? Because of
Probably.
Mozart's naming conventions?
Yes, I think though it was a subconscious decision, but now that you're asking, probably yes.
So why specifically did you choose the early part of the classical era for this program?
Well, two reasons. First of all, our previous concert was about as late as it gets in the classical era. It was an all Beethoven program, and we have had a program last year that focused on lesser known composers of the late classical era as well, a little earlier than Beethoven, but late 1790s and some 80s. So I thought it would be a good idea that our first venture into a full historical program would be to really explore how this whole thing emerged from the earlier side of things. So let's hear a little bit more about this beautiful and fascinating instrument, if you have more stuff to add, which I'm sure you do.
Sure. So as I said before, there's 8 keys, and so you don't actually have to use any of the additional keys. You can play it just like a Baroque oboe. If you want to, you can just use only the 2 keys that the Baroque oboe would have. But having those additional options, for example, on the Baroque oboe, the note B flat is a very covered, soft note.
Right.
And sometimes in classical music, you're going to have to do a forte piano on a B flat, and so you're going to need to have a little bit brighter sound. So that's why they put in this key. That gives you a brighter sounding B flat. Or, the same options for other notes like F sharp. You can get a more covered sound, you have to kind of hide on that note or back away from it, or you can get a more prominent sounding F sharp depending on the phrase or so you make all those decisions as a performer. You can say, oh, in this passage I'm going to use this F, and in that passage I'm going to use this F, and it's every single, I'm doing it all by context of what the music seems like it would work well with.
Right, so I'm assuming this is a copy of a historical instrument, or is this an actual older one?
This is not an actual historical instrument. This is a copy of a
copy.
Yeah, this is a copy of a late 19th century instrument.
Fascinating.
Could you introduce some of the composers on the concert? I'm going to let you pronounce their names because I'm a little worried I'm going to mispronounce them.
So, well, let's take, for example, Josef Myslivchek. He was born in Prague, but he pretty much spent his entire life studying and working in Italy. He became a very prominent opera composer, even though the end of his life was a little less happy. But his music is just so extremely vibrant and lofty and just full of light. And he had a tremendous influence on many of the young composers of his day, particularly Mozart. Actually, he once asked Mozart to sub for him and compose an entire oratorio, which eventually didn't get a chance to be performed, but I mean, that was the level of trust between the two. In fact, the Italians loved him so much, they called him the Divino Boemo, the divine one from Bohemia. And I have a particular affinity for his music, and actually the first movement of one of his symphonies will serve as an overture and an introduction to the entire program. So I just picked that one movement, which it's just like an explosion of confetti. And another composer I'd like to talk about from this program is Giovanni Paisiello, which you had actually helped transcribe the manuscript into a digital form, and thank you for helping also decipher exactly what kind of horns we need, because his handwriting is worse than a doctor's. So Paisiello enjoyed a very vibrant career. He held positions as far east as Russia and in his own native country as far south as Naples, with lots of commissions coming from Vienna and Rome. The overture of his we will be performing is from Le Due Contesse, or The Two Countesses, which is a comic opera or an opera buffa. And it has a typical story about two countesses running after the same guy, which again was very typical of opera buffa at that time. It's either two guys running after the same girl or vice versa, and this opera is no exception. And it's funny how beautifully the overture reflects the ridiculousness of this situation, and I thought it would be another sort of uplifting and interesting element to introduce to the concert. And I think the audience is going to enjoy it a lot, and the orchestra will have a tremendous time playing it.
Out of all the Bach children, why J.C. Bach instead of C.P.E. Bach?
So, all due respect to C.P.E. Bach, and I honestly think he was a far more complex and overall just more intelligent composer than his younger brother. I personally have a special place in my heart for J.C. He's one of my favorite composers, not just from the classical era, but overall. And this symphony we will be performing in G minor is actually his only minor key symphony. He wrote many symphonies. They're all in the Italian style. He moved to Italy, he studied in Italy, he converted to Catholicism. Then he moved to London, and he was sort of always kind of like Handel, and an Italianized German living in London. And his music is just, again, something that had a lot of influence on the general classical development of the time, especially on the most important one of them all, which is Mozart, who actually was a student of his, and particularly in the realm of basso continuo. He was the one who really showed him all the elements of through bass. And it's actually quite remarkable how with this one and only contribution in the minor key, he manages to make it seem like he's been doing it his entire life. I mean, it's just so dramatic and powerful, and actually so much unlike him, because he's usually very all sunshine and rainbows. But this symphony is definitely taking us back to the Sturm und Drang. We really don't hear much about French classical works, and there are many wonderful composers. Actually, Janine is one of them. Another one is Reger. But what I like about Janine in particular is he actually, again, I think this whole program is about people being able to juxtapose different things and in brilliant ways. So he stayed true to the French mannerisms of the day, let's say, but he really combined it with the complexities and power of orchestration that was going on in Germany at the time. And I believe he came up with an incredible specimen. We know he was a prominent violinist. He worked at a big number of theaters around Paris.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, they know maybe a little bit about the French Baroque, like Lully and Rameau, and then they know about Debussy and Poulenc, and there's not that much in between.
Exactly my point. Yes, and so obviously this is a big reason as to why I decided to pick a composer who is not only from a less known era of French music, but someone who actually wasn't as prominent perhaps as some others, such as Cossack, which you had mentioned earlier. And I think he finds these nuances in his music which keep you on the edge of your seat, and I think that goes back all the way to Rameau, whose music I'm also incapable of even listening to or just sitting down. So I think he's staying true to where he comes from, and he incorporates all the innovations of the day.
Okay, last and least famous, Mozart.
Yeah, so, well, again, going back to the name of the ensemble, of course, we don't always program Mozart, but he will always be a prominent member in all of our programs. Why did I choose the overture to Mithridate in particular is because, well, first of all, it's in line with the time frame of the classical era that we're exploring, which is the earlier side again. So that at that time, around 1770, the most prominent opera composer perhaps was Johann Adolf Hasse, and he happened to attend the premiere of Mithridate, and he said, this guy is gonna get us all unemployed. I mean, nobody knew who he is, just this random kid from Salzburg. And I think this entire opera and the overture in particular are important because we usually talk about Mozart's gift for musical depictions of human character and human emotions as relates to his later operas. But we can see here that even as a 14-year-old, he could perfectly depict the sort of explosive character of the protagonist or antagonist of this opera, who is actually a historical character who used to rule the kingdom of Pontus around 200 BCE. And he suffered from severe mental illnesses, delusions of grandeur, no faith in anything greater than himself. He decided that he alone could take on the entire Roman Empire. And he eventually got assassinated, probably by his own son, in an effort to save the kingdom from utter destruction by the Romans. And so this impossible character finds its way into the music of a 14-year-old kid in such a convincing manner. I think this is going to be something that's very interesting to explore for everyone. So Amy, I see you brought a few reeds to show us, and but I have the soul of a 3-year-old, so I'm going to pose this question differently. What's in that box?
Well, this is actually a box of mostly failed oboe reed experiments.
Oh no.
Don't zoom in too much. So a lot of people don't know this, but every oboe uses different reeds. So the modern oboe has a particular set of reeds, the Baroque oboe has different reeds, and this is a classical oboe which has yet again different reeds. And so I have to do a lot of trial and error to make something that works, because the dimensions are different, the cane is different, every part of the setup is different. So it's an interesting learning experience to make these reeds and work with the instrument and feel what feels good, what sounds good.
Absolutely. I mean, as a string player, I cannot imagine having to make something for my instrument by myself, like with knives, and so that's actually incredible.
And the reason why they all have different reeds is because the pitch of the instrument is different. And so the internal dimensions of the instrument are different than a modern oboe or a baroque oboe.
Right.
So you can't just tune your strings the way a violinist would tune. You have to make everything particular for this setup and this instrument to play in tune. That means that we don't have to spend a long time tuning when we get to the orchestra. So we do the tuning at home when we make the reeds. So yeah, it's a huge part of the learning curve with these instruments, and drives me crazy a little bit sometimes, but it's also a lot of fun. So
great. So Amy, since we're doing this program at a lower pitch, it's usually 440, which means the frequency of the A is at 440, but we're going a little bit lower for a historical pitch of 430. So would you like to say a few words about what that actually means for your instrument and in general?
So A430, which is the frequency of the vibration when you play the note A, is 430 is somewhere in between a modern 440 and a baroque 415. It's not a pitch that corresponds to any modern standard, because if you played a modern piano, you wouldn't find an A430. It's kind of in between the A and the A flat, if you want to think of it that way. But pitch was not standardized at all back then. I mean, it wasn't standard in the Baroque, it wasn't standard in the classical era at all. That was a time of huge transitions with the way the instruments were being made and the pitches that people were playing at. So 430 was not any sort of standard. I mean, depending on the region, depending on the preferences of the aesthetic tastes of the people performing, the pitch could have been lower, could have been higher.
Right.
You saw all kinds of tuning forks from different pitches from that era. And so pitch wasn't really standardized until the 20th century.
Right.
And so up until that time, there was all kinds of variation, which actually makes it really interesting, because the way you build the instruments, I mean, to play at a particular pitch with an oboe, you would have to have your instrument custom built to play at that pitch, which means they were really thinking carefully about how they wanted things to sound and what their tastes and preferences were.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that there's sometimes this sort of general, I mean, it's generally right, but it's not entirely on point that we see pitch as historically rising up and up. There were organs in Venice as early as the early 1600s that were pitched at 466. Bach's organ in Weimar was pitched at 466. So it's not always up and up. And again, like you mentioned, it was a very fluid process. And we're definitely excited about 430 in particular because of what you said, that it does not correlate to any sort of modern pitch, because with 415 we're half a step lower, 392 we're a step lower, but 430 is kind of in between. So.
To me, it represents the whole transitional nature of that period.
Right.
Because no two wind instruments are the same. Every single instrument that you see, historical instruments from the period, they're all different. They're all kind of custom built for that player and their own tastes and what they needed to do in that orchestra they were playing with.
Right. So if you're still with us, we would really love to see you all on November 2nd, and all the links are attached. Thank you, Amy, so much.
Thank you, Bar. This has been really enlightening to hear about all the different composers, and you're such a fountain of knowledge about the classical era. And
As are you.
So it's a pleasure to rejoin the orchestra for this project, and I'm really excited that this will be the first historical project that Collective puts on.
Right, and we're beyond excited to have you back with us. Thank you so much.